Windows Server 2019 System Administration. Welcome back everybody. I'm Prakash Vadan, your trainer for this entire series. This is a part 2 of our virtualization that we had a last time discussion in detail. What is the hypervisor? What are the types of hypervisor? Why do we need to use virtualized environment? Those were the things we have discussed in our part 2. Sorry, I mean to say part 1. Now in part 2 we are going to go a bit further in order to deploy your virtualized environment. But before we start installing your hypervisor or installing any kind of your virtual machine where you are going to install your guest operating system, we have a bit far to go. That means we do need to understand many technical terminologies. We need to understand how the switches are created, how the hard disks are created, what are the types of the hard disks, what are the formats of the hard disks, okay, what are the types of switches, how the switches are going to be set a communication in your guest operating system and the host operating system. So these are the things you need to understand clearly before you start installing your virtualization in your network infrastructure. So first, for today, before we start virtual machine, we are going to talk about the two important technical terms over here. That means the terminology. So they are your virtual switch and the next one is a virtual hard disk. I repeat again, in this series we are going to understand clearly before we install the virtual machine in your infrastructure, what are the meaning of the virtual switches, because I do understand you install operating system. That means the main concept over here, the main need over here is to set the communication, because see, installing operating system, obviously the communication has to be there in between the multiple host or the guest operating system. And when we talk about setting a communication is the secondary factor. The first one is that you need to be able to install the host or the guest operating system. So without having the operating system, I don't think you will be able to set a communication between the two devices. So that's why these two topics are very much important for you all before you jump up with the process of installing the virtual machines. Okay, number one is the virtual switch, number two is the virtual hard disk. So first we're going to talk about your virtual switch. So actually we create a virtual switch in our virtualized environment in order to connect the virtual machines. That means in order to set the communication between virtual machines, or please don't forget I am using the term or, in order to set the communication between the virtual machines, or in order to communicate between the host and the guest operating system, you need to have a set of switches. That means you need to have a switch. Normally, when you install operating system, everybody knows we are going to have one physical NIC, of course, in this. This is the physical NIC of your device. Inside this, host operating system, you are going to install the guest operating system. So your guest operating system is somewhere around here. Okay, but when you install, your host operating system, inside the host operating system, when you install the guest operating system, that guest operating system also, you need to have a proper your switch created over here. You need to create switch over here so that it can set a communication between the host and the guest operating system. That means we now need a switch. Otherwise, after installing the operating system as a guest operating system from your host operating system with the help of your hypervisor, that's a software-based platform which we have already discussed in our video 1. If you have missed that, guys, please do see that video. Otherwise, this topic what we are discussing, you will not be able to understand anything. So over here now, it gives you the hypervisor platform. Then you install the guest operating system. Now after installing the guest operating system, we are going to need a virtual switch. Why? In order to set the communication between your physical device and your virtual device. And sometimes you might be willing to set the communication between your host operating systems only. Okay, that means that's a physical word. But our prime concern over here is how to set the communication between two guests. Let's say you have got two guest operating system over here in your Hyper-V, for example. So what type of switch you are going to need in order to set the communication between two devices? Trust me, physical has nothing to do with this. But if you would like to set a communication between your guest operating system and the host operating system, in that case, what type of switch you are supposed to create? You need to understand this clearly. It's not at all. We do have one more thing. What if you'd like to communicate with the rest of the world also? That is outside your physical NIC. See the requirement? we created for three different types of switches in our virtualized environment. Number one, to set a communication between your guest operating system to guest operating system. That means in order to set the communication between two guest operating system, you need to have one type of switch. Next, number two, in order to set the communication between the guest operating system and the host operating system, you need to have another one type of your virtual switch. Number two. Number three, if you want to set the communication between your physical NIC with the help of this virtual NIC to the outside world, in that case, we need to have a third type of switch. So what are the three different types of switches that we're going to need in our virtualized environment that I'm going to explain you in detail? The first switch type that we're going to use in our virtualized environment is the private switch. This virtual switch only allows communication between the connected virtual machines. Don't forget, if you would like to set the communication between only two virtual operating systems, that means only two guest operating system. This is the one guest operating system. This is number two guest operating system. And if you would like to set the communication only between these two devices, not to the physical device, in that case, you need to be sure that you create a switch type as a private virtual switch type. I hope I made it clear. Number two, but sometime you might be willing to set a communication between your host operating system and the guest operating system. In that case, you'll be using the internal switch type. The one of the most advantage or the benefit so-called using this internal switch, okay, is that you'll be able to isolate traffic to be sure that it does not traverse outside the virtual switch. That means it will not go outside. The primary benefit of using either the private or internal virtual switch is for isolating a traffic to be sure that it does not traverse the outside the virtual switch. Or you can say simply over here, when we talk about the internal switch it will help you to set the communication between the host and the guest operating system, not outside the host operating system. Over here, see, this means the host would be able to see the traffic for the internal virtual switch. Of course, because you have set the switch as an internal switch, in that case, you'll be able to see the traffic between your host and the guest operating system. This is not the most commonly used virtual switch in our virtualized environment actually. The third one is most commonly used. That's an external switch. Okay, so external switch, let's see one scenario. This is your host operating system. Inside the host operating system, you are having the guest operating system. So the host and guest can communicate easily. But what if you have a cloud over here? You'd like to go to the world, outside the world also, outside the world of this, your internal network, intranet. You'd like to go to the internet. So in that case, this virtual switch that you have created in a virtual operating system, that should be external switch. That will help you to set a communication with your host as well as the outside this host also. That means you will be able to communicate with the rest of the world also. That is precise answer. The term is internet. So it is the most common type of your Hyper-V switch that will be used in the most environment as it allows connecting virtual machines to the physical network. Okay. Physical network, that means you will be easily be able to go to the outside world also. With the external virtual switch, virtual machine can be connected to the outside world without any additional routing mechanism in place. You don't need routing mechanism if you'd like to use the internet with the help of this host operating system if you have created the external switch. Okay, so I believe I have made it clear over here. When we talk about creating a virtual switch, before you install the operating system, you need to understand these three things clearly. Okay, private switch, internal switch, and the external switch. Private switch in between the guest operating system, internal switch, guest and the host, external switch, outside the world as well. Okay, now the next topic that you need to understand before we jump up with the deployment of your virtualized environment, this is the virtual hard disk. So virtual hard disk is a disk image file actually for storing the complete contents of the hard disk. That means when we create a virtual machine, obviously we need to have a virtual hard disk. And about the types of hard disks, I do believe that we are going to make the contents clear over here right after this. Let's say regarding the hard disk, we are going to talk about, or we'll simply break down the topic of this virtual hard disk in format and the types. But before we talk about the different format of your virtual hard disks and the different types of the hard disks that we're going to use in our virtualized environment, what you need to understand is that every virtual hard disk that you create, that is being used from your physical hard disk only. Means you do have a physical machine. From the physical machine, I am going to create one virtual hard disk. Inside this virtual hard disk, you are going to install the virtual machine. See here. This is the steps actually. Number one, in order to deploy the virtualized environment, you need to have physical machine first. Inside the physical machine, or in terms of this hard disk, if I have to talk about the format or the types, in terms of this physical hard disk, you are going to install or create, you are going to create one virtual hard disk. From the physical hard disk, you are going to create it virtual hard disk. And inside this virtual hard disk, we are going to install the virtual machine. So these are the three steps. So first we are going to talk about the different formats of the virtual hard disks that we are going to find in the market. Number one is VSD. Number two, VSDX. Number three, VSDS. These are the three formats that we are going to talk today in terms of virtual hard disk formats. So these are the formats, not types. Please, I made it clear. These are the formats of the hard disks. About the type, we're going to talk separately right after this. So first one is your virtual hard disk that was introduced in Server 2008 by the Microsoft, having the extension VSD. That was the first use actually. Okay, installing the operating system in your Hyper-V and all. So the first one was created by the Microsoft in Server 2008, but that was limited up to 2 terabyte, not more than that. So format VSD that we use in Server 2008 can support only up to 2 terabyte. But one advantage that you find over here is that it can support Windows environment, Citrix and Oracle also. Since this was the first phase or the beginning phase of this VSD that was being launched by the Microsoft in Windows Server 2008, it has a limited performance actually. And there was no data protection also. And as you know that Microsoft always goes for the advancement from one operating system to next operating system. They overcome some of the limited issues of the any rules or the features. So Microsoft did the same thing when we come by the time Windows Server 2012. So in 2012 Microsoft launched another one virtual hard disk format, that is the VSDX. This is the new. But the one major change made by the Microsoft over here was it can support only Windows. Only for the Windows. It was not for the Citrix and all. But another one advantage, if we compare from the first format to the second format hard disk type, was it can support up to 64 terabyte. From 2 terabyte to 62 terabyte size was added. I think it's more than enough that we use. I don't think that I have used so far 64 terabyte hard disks in your network environment. This is it's practical. Even I have not used ever 64 terabyte. Okay. And the next advancement that we find comparing to the first VSD format type was the corruption protection was there. And metadata tracking was also there. That means this is the preferred format of the virtual hard disk comparing to the Server 2008. That means having only the VSD format. So it was a bit advantages comparing to the Server 2008. But when we come to the Server 2016, trust me guys, that was completely revolutionized in terms of the virtual hard disks. This is known as VSDS and it is also known VSD set. Okay, the new VSD set was launched by the Microsoft in Windows Server 2016, and the drastic change that we find revolutionized in terms of the virtual hard disk storing, that was the shared virtual hard disk. Okay, shared virtual hard disk was actually used over here in Server 2016, having the extension VSDS in a format, and it also support the clustering virtual machines and data are stored in a VSDX file. So these are the three different formats, okay, that we are going to implement in your server environment. Now when we talk about the types of virtual hard disks, okay, the types of virtual hard disks, we are going to have 4 types of virtual hard disks. So when you create a virtual hard disk for your virtual operating system, you need to be precise, you need to understand, you need to make clear that what is the purpose for creating this virtual hard disk, for what purpose you are going to create this, what are the features that you want to use over here. You need to make it clear. So that's why over here I'm going to talk about now virtual hard disk type. Virtual hard disk format is clear. Three formats we have already now discussed. Now this is for the virtual hard disk types. Number one is the fixed size, dynamically expanding, pass-through, differencing. These are the four virtual hard disk types. Okay. Now when we talk about, see over here, number one, fixed size. Fixed size. When you create, virtual hard disk from let's say out of your physical hard disk, the first option is the fixed disk size. If you create 200 GB virtual hard disk out of your physical hard disk, that number one option is the fix. It's something like a hard quota. It's fixed. Either you use it or not, the full space is now used. That's a fixed disk size. Okay, so you need to be careful. Number two, dynamically expanding disks. This is the next option that we are having. Okay, disk type 2, dynamically expanding. Now I'm going to explain how it works. So over here, if you have 200 GB space allocated for your virtual hard disk out of your physical hard disk, but only the 60 GB of data is being stored, trust me, it's not going to occupy 200 GB comparing to your fixed data size, fixed disk size. So this is bit better than your fixed disk. It's going to occupy only 60 GB. If you have used only 60 GB of data out of 200, you see only this much portion will be occupied in your machine, not the full. Whereas if I talk about the first fixed disk size, the full 200 GB will be used. So that's why dynamically expanding disk is a bit better. And the next one, we are having the pass-through disks. Okay, now the one of the most advantage point over here of this pass-through disk is it provides direct access to physical device. Direct access. Remember type 1 hypervisor, this is similar to that. Okay, so see, it depends upon you what type of role or the feature that you are going to install in your operating system, how you want your operating system to function with the help of this virtual machine, how you want your host device to be used by the guest operating system. On the basis of that, you need to select your disk type also. That not format, this is type. Okay, and the next one, the last one is a difference in disks. Difference in disks, it automatically creates two parts over here. Number one is a parent disk, second one is a difference in disk. When you create a disk type while the installation process of your virtual operating system, if you select difference in disk, what it does, all the changes that you made in that operating system, let's say installing your application and all, that will not take place in your parent disk. Only for the booting process, only for loading the operating system, the parent disk will be used. But whatever changes that occurs in that operating system, so it's going to do in a separate file over here. That means separate disks. Changes occur in your difference in disks over here, not in your parent disk. It will not do any changes over here. This is used for only for booting process, or let's say the loading your operating system. It boots from here, okay, out of this physical hard disk, but the changes are made over here. That means two disks are created. So these are the types and the formats of your hard disks and the types of switches that you're going to use in your virtualized environment. I hope I made it clear. Okay, types of switch, utilization of switch, types of hard disk, format of hard disk before you jump up with the virtualized environment. This is a part 2. Now in a part 3, we are going to see the practical implementation of loading your hypervisor, installing the hypervisor, let's say, installing the virtual operating system, and rest of the thing that you can do in your virtualized environment. So if you think this explanation for the types of your switch, types of your hard disk, format of the hard disk was a bit informative to you, please do like and subscribe, and please go through our part 3 video for the virtualized environment practical implementation. Thank you.